The great chamber of the Galactic Concord had never known such silence. And the thousands of delegates from hundreds of worlds sat frozen in their seats as the human ambassador finished speaking her terrible words. Director Helena Vance stood at the central podium with her hands clasped behind her back and her chin raised in defiance. And she did not flinch as the weight of 1,000 alien stares pressed down upon her like a physical force. Earth will launch an expeditionary fleet beyond the Veil in 60 standard days, she repeated, her voice cutting through the stunned quiet like a blade through silk. And we extend an invitation to any species brave enough to join us. The Dasari delegate was the first to react, and his bioluminescent fronds flickered from calm blue to alarmed crimson as he rose from his hovering platform with trembling appendages. This is madness, he declared in the clicking language of his people, that the translation systems rendered into cold synthetic speech. Absolute and complete madness that will doom your entire species. Vance did not respond to him directly, but instead turned her gaze to the Varun Prime Speaker, the ancient crystalline being who had led the Concord for 3,000 years and whose wisdom was said to span the memories of 100 generations. The Prime Speaker's body pulsed with soft violet light as he processed the human's words. And when he finally spoke, his voice resonated through the chamber like the tolling of some great cosmic bell. "Young one," he said, with what might have been pity or might have been contempt, "you speak of the Veil as though it were merely another frontier to be conquered. But you do not understand what lies beyond that boundary." "Then explain it to me," Vance challenged. And several delegates gasped at her audacity in speaking so directly to the Prime Speaker. The ancient being's crystalline form shifted and reformed as he gathered his thoughts. And holographic displays flickered to life throughout the chamber, showing star maps that predated human civilization by millions of years. "The Veil is not a natural phenomenon," the Prime Speaker explained, "but rather the scar left behind by something so terrible that space itself recoiled from its presence. And every species that has crossed that boundary in the 12,000 years of Concord history has been utterly and completely erased." He gestured with one gleaming appendage, and the displays changed to show records of lost fleets and vanished expeditions. Ships from dozens of species that had ventured into the unknown and never returned. Devoran sent 7 great armadas beyond the Veil in our youth, he continued. And not a single ship ever came back, not a single transmission ever reached us. Not a single survivor ever emerged to tell us what they found. The Kethari representative, a writhing mass of interconnected organisms that functioned as a single hive mind, emitted a subsonic hum that made the chamber walls vibrate with distress. We lost an entire colony fleet. The hive mind spoke through 1,000 tiny mouths. 17 million of our kindred consumed by whatever dwells in that darkness. And we have forbidden all travel to the Veil for 9,000 years. Species after species added their voices to the chorus of warning, each sharing tales of expeditions lost and civilizations devastated by whatever lurked beyond the boundary of known space. But Helena Vance stood unmoved through all of it. And when the last delegate had finished speaking, she simply nodded once as though their warnings had only confirmed what she already knew. 47 human colony worlds in the Rim sector have gone dark in the past decade, she said. And her words fell into the chamber like stones dropped into still water. And our investigations have revealed a pattern that your own scientists have been too afraid to acknowledge. She pulled up her own holographic display, and the delegates leaned forward despite themselves as they studied the data she presented. The disappearances are not random, Vance explained, but follow a clear trajectory that originates from beyond the Veil. And the intervals between attacks are growing shorter with each passing year. The Prime Speaker's crystalline form flickered with what might have been uncertainty, and several of the older delegates exchanged worried glances that their younger colleagues did not understand. "You cannot possibly know that," the Thazari delegate protested. But his fronds had shifted to a sickly yellow color that betrayed his fear. "We recovered a probe from the edge of the veil 6 months ago," Vance replied. "A probe that your own Concorde launched 11,000 years ago and gave up for lost. And the data it contained confirms what we have suspected." She paused to let her words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Something is coming," she declared. "Something ancient and hungry that has been slowly awakening for millennia, and it will not stop at the veil forever. So the question is not whether we will face this threat, but whether we will face it on our terms or on its own." The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates shouted and argued, and accused the humans of fabricating evidence to justify their reckless expedition. But Vance simply stood at the podium and waited for the storm to pass when the Prime Speaker finally restored order with a pulse of blinding light from his crystalline body. He turned to face the human ambassador with something new in his ancient eyes. "Even if what you say is true," he said slowly, "what hope does your young species have of succeeding where so many others have failed? And what makes you believe that your fleet will not simply add to the graveyard of ships that already litters the space beyond the veil?" Vance smiled then, a small and fierce expression that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Because we are not going to hide and hope the darkness passes us by," she answered. "And we are not going to send probes and wait for answers that never come. But instead, we are going to take our ships and our soldiers and our scientists into that unknown space, and we are going to find whatever is threatening our worlds, and we are going to make it stop." The vote that followed was unanimous in its condemnation of the human expedition, and the Concorde formally declared that any species participating in the venture would forfeit their membership and protection. But as the delegates filed out of the chamber, many of them noticed that the human ambassador did not look defeated or disappointed. She looked like someone who had already known the outcome and had simply been waiting for the formalities to conclude. 60 days later, the largest fleet in human history gathered at the edge of known space, and the galaxy watched in disbelief as 300 warships aligned their drives toward the shimmering boundary of the veil. The Concorde had spoken. With one voice to forbid this expedition, humanity had answered with one voice of their own. They were going anyway. Admiral Marcus Chun stood on the observation deck of the UES Defiance and watched as ship after ship emerged from hyperspace to join the growing fleet. And each new arrival sent a small thrill of pride through his chest that he carefully kept hidden behind his stoic expression. 300 warships of every class and configuration hung in the void before him, their hulls gleaming with the reflected light of distant stars as they maneuvered into formation around the flagship. Behind the warships came the support vessels, 50 massive colony ships that carried supplies and equipment for a journey that might last years or might end in minutes, depending on what they found beyond the veil and scattered throughout. The fleet were a dozen research platforms bristling with sensors and laboratories, each one staffed by scientists who had volunteered for what many considered a suicide mission. "Final count is in, Admiral," his executive officer reported as she stepped up beside him with a datapad clutched in her hands. 2,300,000 souls across all vessels, and not a single position left unfilled. Chun nodded slowly as he absorbed that number, and he found himself wondering how many of those 2 million people would ever see Earth again. "Any word from the Concorde?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the fleet. Commander Sarah Torres shook her head with a grimace that spoke volumes about her opinion of their former allies. "They pulled their last observation post out of the sector yesterday," she replied, "and the Visari closed their embassy on Earth this morning. So it seems they have decided to pretend we no longer exist." "Can you blame them?" Chun asked quietly. when they believe we are marching to our deaths and taking the goodwill of 100 species with us. Torres was silent for a long moment before she answered, "I reviewed the classified reports again last night," she admitted. "The ones that Director Vance shared with the senior staff before we launched. And I keep thinking about those colony worlds that went dark." Chun finally turned to look at her, and he saw the same mixture of fear and determination in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. 17 million people on Harvest Prime. Torres continued. Gone in a single night without a distress call or a warning, or even a final message to their families. And the Concorde's official position is that it was probably a reactor malfunction. A reactor malfunction that vaporized an entire planet. Chun said flatly, "They know the truth." Torres replied with barely contained anger. "They have known for centuries that something beyond the veil has been slowly reaching into Concorde space. But they are too afraid to face it directly, so they hide behind their treaties and their quarantine zones, and they sacrifice the outer colonies to buy time for the core worlds." Chun placed a hand on their shoulder and squeezed gently. "That is exactly why we are here," he reminded her. "Because humanity does not abandon its people to the darkness. And we do not wait for monsters to come to us when we can go to them first." A chime from the communications console interrupted their conversation, and Torres moved to answer it while Chun returned his attention to the fleet outside. "Admiral," she called out a moment later with an odd note in her voice. "You need to see this." Chun walked over to the console and felt his eyebrows rise as he read the message that had just arrived from Earth. 17,000 personal messages, he murmured, from families saying goodbye to their loved ones on the fleet. Torres nodded and pulled up a few examples on the display. And Chun felt his throat tighten as he read the words that parents had written to children and husbands had written to wives and friends, and written to friends they might never see again. One message in particular caught his attention. A short note from a woman on Mars to her son, who served as an engineer on one of the supply ships. "I know I cannot stop you from going," she had written. "And I know you believe this mission is important enough to risk everything. So all I can do is tell you that I am proud of you, and I love you, and I will be watching the sky every night until you come home." Chun closed the message and took a deep breath to steady himself. "Make sure every crew member receives their messages before we cross," he ordered. "And give them time to record responses if they want to send something back." "Already done, Admiral," Torres replied. "And I took the liberty of scheduling a fleet-wide address for 1800 hours, so you can speak to everyone before we enter the Veil." Chun almost smiled at her efficiency, and he wondered not for the first time how he had gotten lucky enough to have her as his second in command. The hours that followed were a blur of final preparations and last-minute adjustments. And Chun found himself walking through the corridors of the Defiance, speaking to crew members who needed reassurance that their sacrifice would mean something. He visited the medical bay where doctors were, preparing for casualties they hoped would never come. He toured the weapons decks where gunners were running final checks on systems that might prove useless against whatever waited beyond the veil. He stopped by the mess hall where off-duty personnel were sharing meals and stories and trying to pretend that this was just another deployment, and everywhere he went, he saw the same thing in the eyes of his people. A strange mixture of fear and pride and stubborn human defiance that had carried their species from the caves of Africa to the stars themselves. When 1800 hours arrived, Chun stood on the bridge of the Defiance with every screen in the fleet showing his face. And he spoke the words that he had been composing in his head all day. "You know why we are here," he began. "And you know what the Concorde thinks of our mission. But what they do not understand is that humanity has never let fear dictate our choices." He paused and looked directly into the camera, as though he could see every single person watching We crossed oceans when others said we would fall off the edge of the world. And we climbed mountains when others said the air would kill us. And we reached for the stars when others said the void would swallow us whole. His voice grew stronger with each word. The galaxy has told us that what lies beyond the veil is death. And maybe they are right, but I would rather die searching for answers than live cowering in ignorance while our colonies burn. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin. In 6 hours we will cross the veil and enter space that no human has ever seen. And whatever we find there we will face together as one fleet and one people and one species that refuses to go quietly into the night. The response from the fleet was immediate and overwhelming. A wave of cheers and shouts that flooded the communication channels and brought tears to the eyes of hardened veterans who had thought themselves beyond such emotions. And when the 6 hours had passed and the fleet aligned itself toward the shimmering boundary of the veil, not a single ship had departed. Not a single crew member had requested transfer. Not a single human had chosen safety over the unknown. Admiral Chun gave the order, and the fleet moved forward as one. And the last thing they saw before the veil swallowed them was the distant light of Sol, a tiny yellow star that had given birth to a species crazy enough to challenge the darkness itself. The transition through the veil was unlike anything the human fleet had experienced before, and crew members throughout the Armada gripped their stations and held their breath as reality itself seemed to twist and fold around their ships. Colors that had no names streaked across view screens in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the navigation computers screamed warnings in error, codes that their programmers had never anticipated. For 17 terrible minutes the fleet hung, suspended between the known universe and something else entirely. And then, with a sound like thunder echoing through the hull plating, they emerged into a realm that defied every law of physics they had ever learned. Admiral Chun stared at the view screen and felt his mind struggle to process what his eyes were showing him. Stars, burned in shades of violet and crimson and colors that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. And the space between those stars rippled and folded in ways that made his stomach lurch with vertigo. Sensor readings are all over the place, Torres reported from her station with barely controlled panic in her voice. Half our instruments are giving us contradictory data, and the other half have shut down completely. Navigation, Chung called out. Can you give me our position? The navigation officer, a young lieutenant named Park, who had graduated top of her class at the academy, turned to face him with wide eyes that reflected the impossible colors on the view screen. Admiral, I do not even know how to answer that question, she admitted. Our star charts show nothing. Our positioning systems cannot find a single reference point. And according to our instruments, we are currently occupying 17 different locations simultaneously. Chun forced himself to take a deep breath and think clearly despite the wrongness that pressed against his senses from every direction. All ships report in, he ordered, and confirmed that the fleet is intact. The responses came slowly as communication systems struggled to function in this twisted space. But eventually, the picture became clear. All 300 warships had survived the transition, along with the support vessels and research platforms. Though several ships reported minor damage from the passage through the veil, we made it, Torres said with relief that was quickly replaced by uncertainty. But where exactly did we make it to? The answer came 4 days later when the fleet's long-range sensors finally calibrated themselves to the strange physics of this realm and detected something massive in the distance. Admiral, you need to see this, the sensor officer said in a voice that had gone flat with shock. Chum walked over to the sensor station and felt his blood turn cold as he studied the readings. Thousands of ships drifted in the void ahead of them, their hulls dark and lifeless and corroded by radiation that predated human civilization. A graveyard, Torres whispered as she joined him. A graveyard of ships from every species in the Concorde, and dozens more that we have never encountered. Chun gave the order to approach carefully. And over the next week, the fleet picked its way through the drifting wreckage while research teams boarded vessel after vessel to search for answers. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the fleet's chief xenarchaeologist, led the investigation from her platform aboard the research vessel Prometheus. And what she found in those dead ships painted a picture more horrifying than anyone had imagined. They all died the same way. She reported to Chun during a holoconference that connected the senior staff across the fleet. Regardless of species or technology level or era, every single expedition that entered this space met the same fate. She pulled up recordings recovered from the ancient data cores, and the assembled officers watched in grim silence as alien crews faced something that their technology could not comprehend. Some tried to communicate, Tanaka explained as the recordings showed desperate attempts at first contact, broadcasting greetings and mathematical sequences and offers of peace. But whatever they encountered did not respond to any of it. The next set of recordings showed ships fleeing at maximum speed, their drives burning hot as they tried to escape back through the veil. None of them made it, Tanaka said quietly. Not a single ship ever reached the boundary. And the pursuit was so fast that some crews did not even have time to realize they were under attack before they were destroyed. The final recordings were the hardest to watch. Scenes of desperate last stands as alien warriors fired every weapon they had at an enemy that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. The Varans sent their most powerful warships, Tanaka continued, armed with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand supernovas. And they lasted approximately 4 minutes longer than the ships that tried to run. Admiral Chun studied the data in silence for a long moment before he spoke. Do we know what killed them? He asked. Do we have any visual record of the enemy? Tanaka hesitated before answering, and Chun could see the fear in her eyes that she was trying to hide. The Concorde species have a name for it in their oldest religious texts, she said. They call it the absence, and they believe it is what remains of the universe that existed before our own. She pulled up a holographic reconstruction assembled from fragments of sensor data spread across 1,000 different ships. And the assembled officers fell silent as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. It was vast beyond comprehension. A thing of angles and geometries that seemed to fold through dimensions that human minds were not built to perceive. It was old beyond measurement. A presence that had existed since before the first stars had ignited, and would exist long after the last stars had burned out. And it was hungry in a way that transcended physical need. A hunger born of eons of isolation in a void that offered nothing but emptiness and silence. It has been waiting here since before life existed in our galaxy, Tanaka said in a voice barely above a whisper. And every expedition that crossed the veil was like a spark of light in infinite darkness. A spark that it snuffed out simply because it could. The holoconference ended in somber silence, and Chun dismissed his officers to return to their duties, while he stood alone on the bridge of the Defiance and stared at the graveyard of ships that surrounded his fleet. He had led 2 million people into the lair of something that had been killing civilizations for longer than life had existed on Earth, and now he had to find a way to get them out alive. 2 days later, the absence found them. The attack came without warning in the dead of the ships. Night cycle when half the fleet was running on skeleton crews and most of the personnel were sleeping in their bunks. One moment the sensors showed nothing but the drifting wreckage of ancient ships, and the next moment 40 vessels on the fleet's outer perimeter simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no debris, no distress calls. Just 40 points of light on the tactical display winking out like candles snuffed by an invisible hand. Admiral Chun was on the bridge within seconds of the alarm, still pulling on his uniform jacket as he shouted orders to crew members, who were struggling to understand what was happening. All ships. Defensive Formation Alpha, he commanded. Weapons hot, shields to maximum. And someone tell me what the hell just killed 40 of my ships. The sensor officer's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely operate her console. But she managed to pull up a recording from one of the destroyed ship's final transmissions. It showed something moving through the fleet. Something that existed as a whole in reality rather than a physical presence. A darkness that consumed light and matter and energy without leaving any trace behind the absence. Torres said grimly. It found us. Chun watched in horror as another group of ships vanished from the display. Their crews never even knowing what had killed them before they were simply erased from existence. Return fire, he ordered desperately. All ships. Target that thing and hit it with everything we have. The fleet responded with a barrage of firepower that would have reduced a small moon to rubble. Plasma cannons and railguns and nuclear missiles, all converging on the vast darkness that was methodically destroying them. Every shot passed through the absence without effect. The weapons continuing on into empty space, as though the target did not exist in the same reality as the projectiles. Nothing is working, Torres reported with despair creeping into her voice. Our weapons cannot even touch it. More ships vanished from the display. And Chun felt something cold settle in his chest as he realized that they were facing an enemy that could not be fought with anything humanity had brought to this battle. The fleet scattered in desperate retreat, ships breaking formation and fleeing in every direction as their crews sought any escape from the unstoppable darkness pursuing them. But the absence was everywhere at once, a presence that seemed to fill the twisted space around them and close off every avenue of escape. Chun watched his fleet dying and knew that he was about to add 2 million more names to the countless billions that this thing had already claimed. And then a transmission cut through the chaos. A voice that rang with desperate hope rather than despair. Admiral Chun, this is Dr. Tanaka on the Prometheus, the Zen archaeologist said. Do not let the fleet disperse. Repeat, do not let the fleet disperse. We think we have found something. Chun wanted to demand an explanation. But he did not have time for questions when his people were dying by the thousands. All ships, rally on the Defiance, he ordered. Form up around the flagship and hold position until further notice. The surviving vessels of the fleet gathered around the Defiance in a tight formation, and Chun watched the absence circling them like a predator studying its prey. Talk fast. Dear Tanaka, he said over the communication channel. We do not have much time. Tanaka's voice was breathless with excitement and fear as she explained what her team had discovered. We have been analyzing the attack patterns, she said, and we noticed something that everyone else missed because they were too busy trying to fight or flee. She pulled up a holographic display that showed the Payres absence's movements overlaid with complex mathematical patterns. It is not just attacking randomly, she continued. It is responding to our actions in ways that suggest a form of communication. And every time we fire a weapon, it interprets that as a hostile signal and responds with destruction. Chun frowned as he tried to understand what she was saying. You are telling me this thing is trying to talk to us? He asked incredulously. Not exactly. Tanaka replied, I am telling you that destruction is the only language it knows. The only way anything has ever communicated with it in eons of existence. And it responds to hostility with hostility, because that is all it has ever experienced. The Prometheus was breaking formation now, its drives pushing it toward the heart of the absence, while the rest of the fleet watched in disbelief. Dr. Tanaka. What are you doing? Chun demanded. We are going to try something different, she answered. something that no other species has ever attempted because they were all too afraid or too proud or too convinced that violence was the only answer. The research vessel dove directly toward the swirling darkness, and Chun expected it to vanish like all the others, but instead the Prometheus began broadcasting, something that made every sensor on the fleet light up with confusion. It was not a weapon or a shield or any form of attack. It was music, the opening notes of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, echoed through the twisted space around them, followed by mathematical equations rendered as patterns of light and radio waves. The Prometheus broadcast images of Earth's greatest art, paintings and sculptures and architecture that represented the pinnacle of human creativity. It sent recordings of laughter and conversation and the sounds of children playing in parks. On sunny afternoons, it transmitted poetry and literature and the accumulated wisdom of philosophers who had spent their lives asking questions about the meaning of existence and the absence. Stopped for the first time in recorded history, the vast and ancient darkness paused its destruction and turned its attention to something other than annihilation. Chun held his breath as the Prometheus hung motionless at the heart of the entity, its crew broadcasting everything beautiful that humanity had ever created into the void. It is listening. Tanaka's voice came through with wonder. Admiral, it is actually listening to us. The twisted space around the fleet began to stabilize, the impossible geometries slowly shifting into patterns that human minds could comprehend. And then something happened that made every person on every ship gasp in astonishment. The absence responded not with destruction or violence, but with something that might have been a question, a pulse of energy that carried harmonics similar to the music the Prometheus had been broadcasting. I think, Tanaka said slowly, I think it wants to know more. The battle was over. Something else was just beginning. 3 months had passed since the battle that was not a battle, and the remnants of Earth's Armada were finally approaching the veil from the other side. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the shimmering boundary grow larger on the view screen, and he found himself thinking about everything that had happened since that desperate moment when Dr. Tanaka had flown her ship into the heart of an ancient god. The weeks following first contact had been strange beyond anything humanity had experienced before. A slow and careful process of communication between beings that existed on entirely different levels of reality. The absence had no name for itself, no concept of identity as humans understood it, because it had existed alone since before the concepts of names and identity had ever been invented. It had come into being with the universe itself, a remnant of the chaos that had preceded the Big Bang, and it had watched as stars formed and galaxies coalesced and life emerged on countless worlds. But it had never been able to interact with any of it, forever separated by the dimensional barriers that kept it trapped in the space beyond the veil. Every expedition that had crossed into its domain had been perceived as an intrusion, a disruption of the only existence it ever known. And it had responded the only way it understood, with force, with destruction, with the annihilation of everything that disturbed the silence, and had grown accustomed to over billions of years. But humans had done something different, something that no other species had ever tried. They had offered it beauty. They had offered it meaning. They had offered it connection. And for the first time in its eternal existence, the absence had experienced something other than isolation. Dr. Tanaka had spent weeks working with her team to develop new methods of communication, translating human concepts into patterns of energy that the entity could understand. They had taught it about music and how sounds could be arranged to create emotional responses in living beings. They had explained art and how images could capture moments of experience and preserve them for others to share. They had described love and friendship and the 1,000 different ways that humans connected with each other across the distances that separated them, and slowly, impossibly, the absence had begun to respond in kind. It shared memories that predated the formation of the first galaxies. Visions of a universe being born from chaos and the terrible loneliness of watching that universe grow while remaining forever separate from it. It showed them the graveyard of ships through its own perception. And they understood for the first time that it had not been attacking those expeditions out of malice, but out of a desperate and misguided attempt to communicate destruction was all it had ever known. The only language the universe had ever spoken to it. And so destruction was all it had ever spoken back. But now it was learning something new. "Admiral," Torres said quietly, "we are receiving transmissions from Concord Space." Chun nodded and gestured for her to put them on the main screen. The face of the Varan Prime Speaker appeared, his crystalline form flickering with colors that suggested extreme agitation. "Human vessel," the ancient being said in a voice that trembled with something that might have been fear. "Our sensors are detecting your fleet approaching the Veil. But they are also detecting something else. Something vast and impossible that appears to be following you." Chun allowed himself a small smile before he responded. "That would be our friend," he said simply. The Prime Speaker's form pulsed with confusion and alarm. "Your friend," he repeated. "You are telling me that the entity which has destroyed every expedition to cross the Veil for 12,000 years is now your friend?" "It turns out it was lonely," Chun replied. "It has been alone since before your species evolved, since before any species evolved. And it destroyed everything that approached, because destruction was the only form of interaction it understood." He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "We taught it something else." The transmission ended as the fleet began its transition through the Veil, and Chun braced himself for the strange sensations that accompanied the crossing when they emerged on the other side. Every sensor array in Concord Space was watching. What they saw would be recorded in the histories of 1,000 civilizations and passed down through countless generations. As the moment everything changed, Earth's battered fleet, barely 100 ships remaining from the 300 that had departed, emerged from the Veil in formation, but they were not alone behind them. Filling the threshold of the Veil like a tide of impossible geometry came the absence, not attacking, not consuming, following the entity move through Concord Space with a gentleness that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had witnessed its destructive power. Its vast form carefully avoiding the ships and stations that dotted the region around the Veil, and as it moved, the twisted geometries of trans-Veil space began to heal behind it. The dimensional scars that had marked that region for eons slowly fading as the absence learned to exist in harmony with the universe it had been separated from for so long. Admiral Chun broadcast a message to the Concord Assembly as his fleet made its way through their territory toward Earth. "We found what was killing your colonies," he said. "And we did what humanity has always done when faced with something we do not understand." He looked at the view screen where the impossible entity drifted peacefully among the stars it had never been able to touch before. "We reached out our hand and offered it friendship." The response from the Concord was silence, a stunned and disbelieving quiet that stretched across every communication channel in known space. The Varan Prime Speaker finally found his voice. And when he spoke, his words would be remembered for millennia. "We called you reckless," he said slowly. "We called you young and foolish and doomed to extinction. And we never considered that perhaps we were simply old. Too old to remember that the universe does not respond to caution." His crystalline form pulsed with something that might have been shame or might have been wonder. It responds to courage on Earth. 2 million families received word that their loved ones were coming home. And the celebrations that erupted across the planet were unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. But the celebrations were tempered by an awareness that the universe had changed forever. That humanity had done something that would reshape the relationship between every species in the galaxy. They had faced the darkness. Beyond the stars, they had offered it compassion instead of violence, and they had done nothing less than befriend. The end of all things, the galaxy had watched in horror as Earth's Armada advanced into the unknown. Now, they watched in wonder as humanity returned with an ancient god following in their wake, learning for the first time in its eternal existence what it meant to not be alone, and somewhere in the vast expanse of space, an entity that had existed since before time began looked upon the small blue world that had given it something it had never known. Connection, purpose, hope. The absence had a name now, given to it by the humans who had first reached out to bridge the impossible gap between their realities. They called it friend, and friend was finally home.